Let's add some real JavaScript behavior to the example we built in the previous lesson. Now, this example will dip into some JavaScript topics that we'll cover in great detail later on in the course, but it's useful to introduce them now just to illustrate some of the basics of how JavaScript works in web pages and sometimes how it doesn't. In the course of this, we'll be doing a quick whirlwind tour of how to add JavaScript to a page to interact with the page, and a little bit of how to use the debugging tools that are provided in the browser to see what's going on in our web page as we work on it. So what we're going to do for this example is add some interactivity to the page you see on your screen. Specifically, the interactivity that we're going to add is that we're going to hide part of this screen from the user when the page first loads, and then we're going to add a button that when you click the button, it makes that part of the page appear. So what we will do is go to our code editor, and what we see here is the HTML that we just developed in the previous example. And what I'm going to do is add to this page a button. And you can see that all I've done is created a div, and I've given it the class of button. And if we jump over to the CSS, you can see I've already added a bunch of styles that target a class named button, the purpose of which is to make this thing look like a button. And I've also given it an ID, and as you know from HTML, an ID that you assign to an element in a page is intended to be unique and just refer to one element on a page. I could have a whole bunch of things with class equals button on the page if I have lots of buttons, but there's only one of them that would be the what's next button, which is the ID that I've assigned for this one. So now I have a button on the page. Let's go ahead and save this and jump into the HTML and see if that worked. Yep, I have a button now that says click me to find out what's next, and that was the intended behavior. Now the next thing I said I wanted to do is actually have a part of the page hidden when the page first loads so that that button will make it appear. Now the way I'm going to do that is take this div here that contains the do you like green eggs and ham and the image, and I'm going to give it an ID as well. Now these IDs end up being very important when you're writing JavaScript to interact with a page, because it gives you a handle, a way to reach over into the page and get that thing so that you can manipulate it using JavaScript. This is something you'll do very commonly. Now the last thing I have to do in order to make that not visible when the page loads is go into my style sheet, and let's see, we called it what's next as its ID. So I will simply add a style here that sets display to none for any element that has the ID of what's next. Now I've saved all this, and I can go back to the browser and reload, and sure enough I have a button that says click me to find out what's next, and the thing that I want to reveal when I click that button is not seen. Now just to jump in a little bit at what the developer tools can do for us here, with this example, I'm going to open developer tools, and I can go to my elements, and I can see the structure of this page as it's laid out. So I've got my my div that contains pretty much everything on the page, and I've got these other ones. Here's my I am Sam, and here is my Sam I am, which you can see as I mouse over this element in the HTML tree, it actually is highlighting that element on the page as we go. And we can go down here to the what's next div, and sure enough, that doesn't show up at all as intended. Now if we come over here, you can actually see the styles that are applied to this element, and here's our what's next style statement that we put in that says display none. If I uncheck this box, it actually removes that style from the display of the page. So checking and unchecking this box is actually making that element appear. And this is the thing that we're going to do with JavaScript instead of doing it right here in the debugger, but I wanted to show just how useful this debugger can be, and even finding elements on the page that don't exist. Finding elements on the page that aren't showing yet, and manipulating them in all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that debugger open, and we're going to jump back and actually do some JavaScript. So here's my empty JavaScript file that is linked into this application. And the thing that we're clear that we need to do is use that ID in some way to grab onto that button and detect if it's been clicked. Now here's where we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm going to again take you on a whirlwind tour through these JavaScript objects and how they interact with the page. Now, the place you need to start for a lot of this is a good reference site. W3 Schools is one. The Mozilla Developers Network is another one, although that one tends to be a bit more technical. It's more complete, it's more accurate, but it can be overwhelming if you're just trying to find a way to do a simple thing. And we're going to jump over here to the JavaScript reference. JavaScript tutorial is not bad either. Sometimes if you're just looking to find out how to use a particular function, you can see examples there. But we're going to go to the reference, and here is down the left-hand side all these menu items that show the different things that you can look up about JavaScript. We're going to be using these a lot over the next 14 weeks. But what we're going to go into right now is this thing called the document. The DOM document. The DOM is the document object model, and it is the way that JavaScript can access everything that appears on that web page. In particular, if we go down and look through all of the properties and methods that we can see on the document object, we have one called getElementById and several others that are all about getting elements. getElementById is the one that we're going to use to get a handle on that button so that we can detect whether it's been clicked. And we can see the usage here, and it's getElementById, and then in quotes you put the name of the element that you were trying to access. So that's what we're going to do. Let's jump back to our code, and I am going to do document getElementById what's next button, because that's the ID we assign to our button. And I am assigning that to a variable that I've called next button. Now, a variable is basically a container that holds on to some bit of information that you've retrieved from somewhere. In this case, and we're going to talk about this a lot next week, but in this case, I've gotten this element from the document object, and I need to put it somewhere where I can refer to it and make use of it. And that is this variable called next button. So I have that, and now what I need to do is detect when that thing gets clicked on. It turns out the answer to that is back here in our reference documentation, and in this case the click event is actually called an event in JavaScript. It's the document object model event, and if we click on DOM events, we can see there's a whole bunch of them here for on click and on double click and mouse over and mouse out and so forth. On click is the one we're looking for, right? We want to know if somebody hits that button, we want to make something happen. And it shows us in basic form how it's used. So we're going to jump back here, and we are going to create an on-click handler. So my next button is the element that represents the button on the page, and the on-click handler, I'm assigning it a function which is going to contain the behavior that we want to happen. Now, one of the things that's good to have in your JavaScript are comments, and so I'm going to insert a comment just to let us know that this is the on-click handler. Comments are preceded by a slash and an asterisk, and they're concluded by an asterisk and a slash. There's other ways to make comments as well that we will get into in later weeks in the course. But in any case, now the code that I put inside here is what's going to run when somebody clicks that button. Pardon my clock. And in this particular case, what is it we want to happen? Well, we want to make that what's next div, which is right here, we want to make that appear, which in this case means setting its style, the display style, which is now set to none. I need to set it to something other than none so that that element that's here displays. In order to make that happen, the first thing we're going to do is, again, we're going to use the getElementById to get hold of that what's next div that's on the page. And I'm again going to assign it to a variable that I've called what's next element. These names are arbitrary. There are rules about what you can name them and what you can't, and we're going to cover those an awful lot as we get into next week. But for now, suffice to say that I've used a useful string of characters that describes what it is that this variable is going to hold. So now I've got my what's next element from this page, presumably in this container called what's next element. And then the last thing I need to do is make it display when the user clicks the button. So what I'm going to do with my what's next element is I'm going to set its style property, which contains all the CSS styles that are associated with that element on the page, and I'm going to set it to block. And block is, for display property, it's basically the opposite of none. Actually, any value that's not none, any valid value that's not none, will make the item display, although in different ways. So here I have my next button, and I have my onClick handler for that button, and hypothetically, when I click that onClick handler, it's going to retrieve the what's next element and make it show. So let's jump to the HTML and see if that's what happened. I reload the page. I can see in my sources view, here is my JavaScript code. So these debuggers are fabulous for being able to see exactly what's happening in your code. If I click that button, do you like green eggs and ham appears. And it only took a few lines of code to do something like this. Now the one other thing I'm going to point out here is the usefulness of the debugger. Now by clicking on the line number here over on the left hand side, I've set a breakpoint in the code. And what that means is when the execution of the code reaches that line, it's going to stop and it's going to let me interact with the page right at that point. So I've set a breakpoint on line 7. I'm going to reload the page, and when I click on this, it says paused in debugger. So it's done exactly what I wanted. The code has stopped its execution right here, and I can see, let me get rid of that, I can see right here the variables that are in scope. I have the what's next element, which right now is undefined, which is simply JavaScript talk for I haven't assigned anything to it yet because this line of code hasn't run. If I use this button to step forward one line, I can now see that the what's next element contains a div with the ID of what's next, which is exactly what I intended. Now what's interesting is if we open this up, we can see all sorts of properties and objects, and in some cases even methods that are associated with this HTML object on the page. Sometimes it can be very illuminating to look through this and see the kinds of properties and methods that might be available on a particular object on the page. These will be somewhat different for, say, an input element of a form than it is for a paragraph or a div tag on the page. But in any case, this is available for you to look at any time while your code executes so that you can see exactly what's happening behind the scenes while it runs. You'll notice that the items that appear in this list You'll notice that the items properties that appear in this list are very similar to the ones we saw when we looked at the reference for a DOM element here. Class name and child nodes and client height and client width. If we come over here, client height, client width, and so forth. So this is a great way to really examine the things that the browser is making available to you as the JavaScript programmer through the DOM. This is how all your JavaScript will interact with web pages in everything we do in this course. So this is a good tool set to get familiar with now. Now if I hit this play button, it's just going to resume the execution of the script, and there's our green eggs and ham just the way we intended it.